Segment 22A, Introduction. The Bolshevik Party had seized the reins of power in Russia. But the First World War was not yet over. Moreover, potential enemies were everywhere, internal and external. The world revolution promised by Marx was becoming less and less likely. The Bolsheviks would therefore have to create a Soviet-Russian state out of scratch. The tensions between building this Russian-Soviet state and the drive toward world revolution would create big problems in the 1920s. In segment 22B, the uncivilized wars, we will trace the various classes of adversaries faced by the infant Bolshevik regime, which now called themselves the Communists. These problems included the relationship of foreign nations with established armies, the so-called White Russian armies which appeared during this time period, and the liberation movements which sprang up in non-Russian parts of the former Russian Empire. Ultimately, the Soviet Red Army prevailed, but at a tremendous cost. Millions of civilians died, and the Russian nation's infrastructure was all but destroyed. In segment 22C, War Communism, Lenin and his communists are forced to put their dream of world revolution on the back burner. Once the smoke from the Russian Civil War had cleared, Communist Russia was now envisioned as the homeland of world revolution. But even the homeland of world revolution needs a functioning economy. To get Communist Russia back on its feet, Lenin came up with a ruthless economic policy called War Communism. Basically, what the government wants, the government takes. One result of War Communism was outright revolution against the Communists, which the Communists renamed Counter-Revolution. Segment 22D, the Soviet Union is created, covers the conversion of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, that's the RSFSR, into the Soviet Union. Although the Commissar for Nationalities, Iosif Stalin, wanted to absorb all of the nationalities into a huge Russian state, Lenin insisted on a union of Soviet republics in which Russia was the first among equals. Lenin won. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was created. To strengthen the new Soviet Union, the new economic policy was brought about, the NEP so-called, to heal the wounds made by war communism. To assist the world revolution predicted by Marx, the Communist International, or Comintern, was created. However, the Comintern very quickly became a mere tool of Soviet foreign policy. Segment 22B, the Uncivilized Wars. On January 12, 1918, the Third National Congress of Soviets established communist power over Russia. Wherever the provisional government had claimed power, the RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, was now in control. But before Lenin could bring up his dictatorship of the proletariat, he had to deliver on his promise of peace. The Bolsheviks started peace talks with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk in November 1917, but half-heartedly so. Lenin hoped that America's recent entry into the war would help Britain and France destroy the central powers of Germany and Austria. But the Germans were still holding on unto the Western Front. And on the Eastern Front, the Germans were dangerously close to both Petrograd and Moscow. The Bolshevik slogan, "No peace, no war," may have fooled the Russian people. But the Germans hold all the cards and they knew it. If Lenin and company wanted Russia to be left alone, the Germans wanted Poland and the Baltics and most of Ukraine. Again, the time to hesitate was through. The Japanese were already sending troops into Russia's far eastern empire and the port of Vladivostok. Parts of the old empire were breaking off, the Baltic and Caucasian nations, Poland and Ukraine. In the heartland, the so-called White Russian movement united Tsarist generals and various anti-communist movements against the new Bolshevik regime. Not all of the communists, as the Bolsheviks now called themselves, supported Lenin's decision to surrender all of this land. Surrender was not just a blow to Russian pride, but it would put the new nation at Germany's economic and military mercy. Once more, Lenin got his way, establishing once and for all his domination of the Communist Party and of the new Soviet state. The dictatorship of the proletariat was in fact the dictatorship of Lenin. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March. Shortly afterward, the Communists' capital moved from Petrograd to Moscow. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk also gave France, Britain, and the U.S. an excuse to land peacekeeping troops at various points around the Russian Empire. Thanks to the Ottoman Empire's decay, the communist regime was safe from the south. And eventually the British, French, and Americans did pull out. But in the Far East, the Japanese got even bolder for a while. They were not coaxed out of Vladivostok until 1920. When this happened, the new communist regime was isolated from the rest of a hostile world. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Germans set up buffer states in Ukraine, including much of Poland, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Fortunately for these new buffer states, German occupation ended along with the war, thanks to the armistice of November 11, 1918. Freedom from Germany did not necessarily mean enthusiasm for communism. Lenin's Declaration of Rights of Peoples of Russia promised great things: equality for all, political self-determination, freedom of religion, and the right of each people to retain its national culture. All well and good, but the buffer states were tired of Russians in general, and they wanted to form their own independent capitalist states. For once, Lenin was in no hurry to press matters. Since he believed that Marxist world revolution was imminent, independence was just a cute buzzword to him. Sooner rather than later, he believed, the class war would end, putting the world under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Indeed, some communists even thought capitalist states would speed up the world revolution by making the workers and peasants into radicals. Meanwhile, the communists' attention was drawn to a bigger internal threat. The White Russian movement was not, in fact, an organized anti-communist movement. Rather, it was a disorganized flock of each Tsarist generals, such as the former Supreme Commander, General Kornilov. Each ex-general had his own client army and his own reason for hating the communists. The Whites had no ideas for ruling Russia in case of victory. While the communist regime was strapped for money and materials, the White armies were strapped for money, materials, and for an overriding principle. This was one major Bolshevik strongpoint. The Red Army soldiers knew their positions were what Lenin said they were, and they did as their supreme military commander, Lev Trotsky, ordered them. In summer 1918, Trotsky conscripted all men between 18 and 40 and pressed ex-Tsarist officers into service as military specialists. Because Trotsky himself had no military experience, the actual fighting was directed by his lieutenants. But nobody questioned that Trotsky was the key to the Red Army's ultimate success. By the end of the Civil Wars, Trotsky's Red Army was 5 million men strong. The precise details of these uncivilized wars don't concern us here. They are more important for their magnitude and for their savagery. Both Reds and Whites were routinely guilty of terrible atrocities. Sometimes a city or location changed hands several times during the wars and suffered accordingly. For example, Kiev, cradle of the Rus civilization, had been a part of the Russian Empire since the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav. After the February Revolution, Ukraine became one of the German buffer states. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Ukrainians happily established their own national republic. In 1919, the Ukrainian People's Republic took over. But by this time, the communists were beating the White Russians, freeing the communists to grab a chunk of eastern Ukraine, including Kiev. Western Ukraine, however, had been overrun by the newly recreated Polish state. Kiev changed hands again on May 7, 1920, when Polish and Ukrainian forces took it away from the communists. The Russo-Polish War was on, and Kiev was caught right in the middle. As it turned out, the communists wasted so much time taking Kiev back, they were unable to capture Warsaw. The Treaty of Riga, signed March 18, 1921, effectively ended the Russo-Polish War as a draw. Yet Ukrainian revolutionaries continued desperate resistance against the communists for years. The establishment of the Soviet Union with reasonably secure boundaries did not mean complete communist control. Segment 22C, War Communism. When everyone really is out to get you, it's really not paranoia. The RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, had fought off expeditions sent by Britain, France, and the U.S. But there was no guarantee that capitalist powers like Japan or the U.S. had given up their designs on the Soviet Far East. The communists had put down the so-called White Russian warlords, but there were still plenty of white guerrillas left, especially in Ukraine. The communists were wiping out Russia's other political parties, but these things take time. Aside from its internal woes, Communist Russia was the outcast of the civilized world, unrecognized by the victorious Allies and excluded from worldwide diplomacy. To the communists, Russia was an isolated island in a capitalist sea. They saw themselves as an elite caste of holy warriors fighting a class war against capitalism, spreading the holy Marxist cause as interpreted by Lenin. Trotsky's mighty Red Army had smashed the communists' enemies, but it could not rebuild Russia's infrastructure, and it could not fix Russia's economy. The new Russian state was run on a principle called war communism. To Lenin, the ends always justified the means, and the most important end was to ensure the communists stayed in power. Although the Soviets officially ruled, and the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," was still heard. In fact, all decisions were made in Moscow by Lenin and by his Sovnarkom, his advisors. The decisions to strip the peasants of their grain came from Moscow. To Lenin, the peasants, especially the better off ones, or kulaks, were all leeches anyway. And peasants who wanted to keep more grain than they could eat deserved death. The decision to conscript all able-bodied males into the Red Army came from Moscow. The penalty for refusal to serve was death. All economic decisions, great or small, came out of Moscow, and there was no appeal. It's not that there wasn't friction. Even the communists themselves disagreed from time to time. Sometimes even Lenin had to defend himself. The Red Army commander Trotsky and the Nationalities Commissar Stalin already hated each other. But the communists always closed ranks against their enemies when the time came. They were guided less by Marxist scripture than by the will to survive. When the Central Committee decided in August 1918 that the deposed royal family could be a rallying point for the White Russians, the entire family was shot. Later that month, Lenin himself was wounded by a socialist revolutionary named Vanya Kaplan. This gave the Lenin secret police the Cheka, an excuse to eliminate droves of communist political opponents, real or perceived. Those political opponents, famous enough to be known outside of Russia, were packed up and sent into Western exile. They were lucky. They survived. Faith in Marx's impending world revolution affected all the communists' decisions. The Red Army was planned not to defend the communist regime from the Whites, the Greens, the Poles, or the Western Allies. It was designed to help the oppressed European proletariat to overthrow its masters. The communists routinely paid their expenses by printing new rubles. Even if these rubles were worthless, Marx taught that money would become obsolete in the new workers' paradise. Lenin assumed the non-Russian peoples of the former Russian Empire, the Finns, Ukrainians, Poles, Balts, and Caucasians, would beg to be allowed to join their Russian comrades. Indeed, the Declaration of the Rights and Peoples of Russia was designed to lure these non-Russian nationalities in. Of course, this supposedly noble offer assumed that the non-Russian peoples were willing to go back under Russian leadership. And plans can fall through, as so often they do. Communist revolutions failed in Germany and in Hungary. While the Red Army was off fighting the White Russians, the Finns claimed and kept their independence. When the newly restored Polish nation fought with Russia over Ukraine, Lenin had the Red Army chase the Poles back to Warsaw. As a Marxist, Lenin expected the Polish workers to join their communist liberators. But his hopes were dashed when it turns out that the Polish people of all classes just plain hated Russians no matter what. And as mentioned earlier, the Ukrainians never did stop fighting the Russians. To worsen matters, revolution broke out in two important and previously pacified areas. In mid-1920, a socialist group called the Union of Toiling Peasants revolted in Tambov province. The Tambov rebellion was not the first peasant uprising against the communists, but it was unique for its size and for its socialist program. The Union of Toiling Peasants fought against communism to save socialism. It took 30,000 Red Army veterans more than a year to put out this fire. The communists were so desperate at times that they resorted to using chemical weapons on their own people. Their hold on the countryside remained very sketchy. Also, in February 1921, the sailors of the Kronstadt Naval Base on an island near Petrograd broke out in open revolt against the communists. During the October 1917 revolution, the Kronstadt sailors had been Lenin's most devoted supporters in the military. In fact, they had fired the October Revolution's first shots from the cruiser Aurora. 4 years later, 50,000 Red Army veterans had to put out the Kronstadt revolt. 10,000 of the Red Army soldiers were killed in the process. The surviving sailors were brutally punished. The lucky ones either escaped or were executed. If even the communists' early supporters were deserting them, it was a clear sign that war communism had outlived its usefulness. It was time for Lenin to make nice, which he will do after this cough drop. Segment 22D. The Soviet Union is created. The communists replaced war communism with the New Economic Policy, NEP for short, on March 21, 1921. The NEP guarded the alliance between workers and peasants, the Smichka, upon which the communists based their power. It set a level of surplus grain or other agricultural product for the peasants to give to the state. The remaining surplus was dispensed of as the peasants pleased. Most of heavy industry, transportation, and finance stayed in communist hands, but even this limited market economy paid dividends. Given a motive to be productive farmers, the Russian peasants came through. In fact, production of grain surpassed pre-World War I times, as the peasants drove an economic boom. Thanks to the new economic policy success, Soviet industry, still battered by civil war, had more leeway in planning their production. At first, the industrial sector barely kept up with the demand for manufactured products. But when the demand continued growing, the factories found they could earn just as much profit by making fewer products and charging the peasants more. Soon the peasants were producing too much grain. The only grain buyers now were illegal speculators who stored it until higher prices returned. By October 1923, the peasants and the industrial sector had literally switched places in the Smichka, and industry was driving the economy, not the peasants. Eventually, the NEP lost popularity with communists. Marx had never been a big fan of supply and demand, and even a small dose of capitalism offended old Bolsheviks who had risked their lives bringing down the Tsar. The grain speculators and even some peasants were getting a little bit too rich for the Communist Party's liking. Bad harvests also played a role. But the biggest threat to the present worker alliance was the rise to power of Iosif Stalin. As the new communist state assumed permanent borders and the NEP built up the economy, Lenin and company worked on the communist state's permanent form. The word of the Commissar for Nationalities, Iosif Stalin, carried great weight on this topic. Though Stalin himself was Georgian by birth, he wanted to keep all the former subject peoples of the Russian Empire in the existing RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. Stalin believed, with reason, that letting non-Russian peoples consider themselves independent was dangerous. But Stalin had a difficult opponent. Vladimir Lenin would employ any means to reach communist ends in Russia or elsewhere. He was ingenious at interpreting Marx's writings to justify whatever political maneuver he pulled next. His friends could become enemies just like that, and vice versa, but even Lenin had his principles, and national self-rule was one of them. Lenin himself was a Russian, but he would not abide forcing Ukrainians, Balts, Belarusians, Caucasians, and Poles into one big Russian state. To him, that was Tsarism all over again. Lenin wished to create a union of Soviet socialist republics composed of the Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Transcaucasian, that is, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, socialist republics alongside the RSFSR. Under Lenin's scheme, each republic was officially equal, officially independent, ruled by its own Communist Party. Additional republics could be added to the Soviet Union on an equal basis, much as, at least in theory, additional states could be added to the U.S. under the Northwest Ordinance. Again, that was the theory. In fact, the entire Soviet Union was under the All-Russian Communist Party, that is to say, the already existing Communist Party of the RSFSR. In December 1922, Lenin got his way. To avoid any appearance of Russification, the new republics were allowed to use their national languages and retain national traditions. Supposedly, any republic could secede from the new Soviet Union whenever it wanted. But when the Soviet Union received its constitution in 1924, nobody ever dreamed of that possibility. Though the Soviet Union had now been declared the homeland of communism, the communists themselves had not given up on world revolution. Far from it. In 1919, the Communist Party created the Third International, or Comintern, expressly designed to promote its brand of revolution throughout the world. Unlike the Socialist International, which was a democratic assembly of authentic socialist parties from around the world, membership in the Comintern was reserved for international parties either created by, controlled by, or sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Some European communist parties quickly became large and powerful, as in Great Britain, France, Germany, and Spain. Other parties, especially in the Far East, China and French Indochina, grew more slowly, but showed greater lasting power. The Communist Party of the United States, although lavishly supported by the Soviet Union, was never much of a force politically or intellectually. Although all of these parties supposedly reached out to the workers and peasants of their nations, the Western parties were specifically Soviet tools. The leaders of these communist parties were trained in Moscow and returned to Moscow regularly to report and get further instructions. If they ever questioned Moscow's orders or failed to carry them out, they were removed, or once Stalin took power, they were removed from the face of the earth. The Eastern Communist parties would be more successful than the Western Communist parties, but not for years to come. Segment 22E. Conclusions. 1. Everyone was out to get the Bolsheviks. The White Russians, Green Russians, Poles, Germans, Finns, Ukrainians, Austrians, Japanese, Britons, Germans, again, and even Americans all tried to knock off the Bolshevik state. The Americans even exported to Russia people suspected of being Bolshevik sympathizers. The Bolshevik state survived because it had internal lines of communications and supply, and because it could deal with the attacks one after another. Had there been any coordination of the attacks, chances are that the Bolsheviks would not have hung on. Recall that Russia is lacking in natural defenses, and the Soviets had nowhere near enough men to defend every front at any time. This piling up on the Bolshevik state was never forgotten. In fact, it had a tremendous effect on how Soviet leaders conducted foreign affairs. Trust nobody, walk loudly, and carry a really big stick. 2. Resistance never really petered out. The White Russian movement, which really had no program anyway, eventually packed up and left. Although the USSR fought very hard as what they saw as the white emigre threat, the major threat to the Soviet Union was in fact internal. Although Stalin would whip up conspiracies of Trotskyites and foreigners out of thin air, anti-Soviet resistance tended to be nationalist in form. For example, Ukraine was always in danger of going out of control, as well as Caucasian regions, notably Chechnya. The standard techniques of repression were employed, but Stalin was also not above practicing ethnic cleansing. Entire nations would be packed onto unheated boxcars and dumped off in the middle of nowhere, just because they made Stalin a little nervous. When the German invaders came in 1941, many so-called Soviet people welcomed the invaders with open arms. They couldn't believe that anyone could be as evil as Iosif Stalin. Sadly, they were wrong. 3. Forget about principle. Lenin and his minions found out that inventing a government out of scratch was not very easy. The new Soviet government veered between war communism, which basically consisted of grabbing whatever wasn't tied down, and the new economic policy, which was just gussied up capitalism, or maybe capitalism light. The Soviet Union also needed Western help in rebuilding its heavy industry. Strangely, the most friendly country to the Soviet Union in its early years was Weimar Germany. In return for German help with military technology, the Soviets allowed Germany to train troops, test new weapons, and engage in war games on their land, all on Russian soil, and all specifically forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. 4. Workers of the world unite or not? The world revolution preached by Marx turned out to be a big bust. German revolution failed, as did the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic. As early as the middle 1920s, the Soviets were trying to meddle in China with awful results. Strangely, the Soviet brain trust in China was just as keen about winning over the nationalist commander, Chiang Kai-shek, as they were in supporting the devoted communist leader, Mao Zedong. The same thing happened during the Spanish Civil War, in which the forces of Francisco Franco, who is still dead, fought a loose Republican grouping of socialists, anarchists, and communists. The Soviets were more interested in wiping out Spanish Trotskyists than in fighting Spanish fascists. When Stalin signed the famous 1939 Non-Aggression Pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact with Germany, he even handed over to Hitler many German communists who had fled for safety to the arms of the USSR.